Sometime during the 8th or ninth century, an unknown poet walked through the remains of a ruined Roman town, probably the city of Bath. The poet's name has been lost, but the verses survived. They describe shattered halls, collapsed roofs, and abandoned baths where warm water once flowed for wealthy citizens. To the people of that era, these ruins seemed almost impossible to understand. They belonged to a civilization that had vanished long before their own time. The poem, known simply as The Ruin, captures a feeling that must have been common across Britain: wonder mixed with sadness, admiration mixed with confusion. How had such magnificent buildings been constructed? And why had the people who built them disappeared? To answer those questions, we must travel back to the height of Roman power. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain was part of one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. Roman engineers built roads, forts, temples, theaters, and cities across the island. Trade connected Britain to Spain, Gaul, North Africa, and even the distant markets of the East. Yet despite all its achievements, Roman Britain contained weaknesses that would eventually lead to its collapse. The story of its rise and fall is not only a tale of conquest and empire. It is also a story of ambition, rebellion, economic decline, and the slow disappearance of a way of life. Before the Romans arrived, Britain lay beyond the edge of what many Mediterranean people considered the known world. The island was separated from mainland Europe by a narrow but dangerous stretch of sea. Storms, strong currents, and unpredictable weather made the crossing difficult. Roman writers described Britain as a mysterious land inhabited by fierce tribal peoples. Julius Caesar attempted to invade Britain in 55 and 54 BC, but his expeditions achieved little. Later emperors planned additional invasions that never materialized. One ruler, the eccentric Caligula, famously assembled a large force on the coast of Gaul only to abandon the campaign. It was the Emperor Claudius who finally succeeded. In AD 43, Roman legions landed in southern Britain and fought a series of battles that gradually brought much of the island under Roman control. The conquest was not easy. Tribal confederations resisted fiercely, and the Romans had to rely on disciplined infantry, engineering skill, and relentless organization. As Roman forces advanced northward, they encountered the rugged lands of what is now Scotland. Here they faced determined resistance from tribal groups that knew the terrain intimately. Rather than conquer the entire island, the Romans eventually established a frontier. The most famous symbol of that frontier was Hadrian's Wall, a massive stone barrier stretching from coast to coast. Once military control had been established, the Romans transformed Britain with astonishing speed. Small settlements became thriving towns. London, once a modest riverside community, grew into a major commercial center. Public forums, temples, bathhouses, and theaters appeared across the province. The Roman world was connected by roads, and Britain became part of that network. Goods flowed in from every direction. Wine arrived from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, fine pottery from continental workshops, and luxury items from distant regions of the empire. In return, Britain supplied metals such as lead, iron, silver, and tin. For many inhabitants, Roman rule brought opportunities. Local elites adopted Roman customs, built villas decorated with mosaics, and participated in imperial administration. Yet beneath this prosperity lay an important problem. Britain was expensive to hold. The province required a large military presence. Tens of thousands of soldiers were stationed across the island to defend against northern raids, suppress unrest, and protect trade routes. Maintaining these forces consumed enormous resources. Britain benefited from imperial investment, but it rarely generated enough wealth to fully cover the cost of its own defense. This military burden created a dangerous paradox. Any governor who commanded Britain's army controlled one of the largest concentrations of Roman troops in the Western Empire. That made the governor a powerful political figure. Whenever the imperial throne became contested, ambitious commanders in Britain saw an opportunity. If they could transport their legions across the Channel, they might seize power in Rome itself. The first major example was Claudius Albinus in the late 2nd century. Backed by his troops, he declared his claim to the imperial throne and marched against Rome. To do so, he stripped Britain of much of its military protection. Although Albinus was eventually defeated, his rebellion left the province exposed to raids and internal disorder. The same pattern repeated again and again. Generals looked toward Rome, gathered their soldiers, and sailed away. Each time, Britain was left vulnerable. By the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was entering a period of profound instability. Plagues reduced the population, trade declined, and civil wars erupted between rival claimants to the throne. Inflation weakened the economy, and barbarian groups along the frontiers grew stronger and more organized. Archaeologists can trace this instability through buried coin hoards. During peaceful times, people kept their wealth in homes or secure storage. During dangerous times, they buried it in the ground. The growing number of hidden coin hoards in Britain reveals increasing anxiety among the population. Economic decline became visible in everyday life. Pottery production became less varied. Industrial activity shrank. Public buildings received fewer repairs. The great urban centers of Roman Britain still stood, but maintaining them was becoming more difficult. One of the most dramatic moments came in AD 367. Along Hadrian's Wall, Roman soldiers either mutinied or were persuaded to cooperate with northern raiders. Pictish forces crossed the frontier, while Irish raiders, Saxons, and other groups attacked different parts of Britain almost simultaneously. Roman defenses were overwhelmed. Towns were plundered, military commanders were killed, and bands of deserters roamed the countryside. For a time, large parts of Britain descended into chaos. Eventually, the general Flavius Theodosius restored order, but the psychological impact was enormous. The attacks demonstrated that the empire could no longer guarantee security as confidently as it once had. Confidence in Roman power began to erode. After the crisis of the 4th century, signs of decline became increasingly obvious. Trade with other parts of the empire weakened. Workshops closed. Iron became more expensive. Public infrastructure deteriorated. In cities such as Canterbury, sewers clogged with silt and were not properly cleared. Bathhouses accumulated debris. Buildings that had once symbolized Roman civilization gradually lost their maintenance. The change was not sudden. People still lived in the cities, traded goods, and used Roman institutions. But the economic foundation that supported urban life was weakening year by year. In AD 383, the governor Magnus Maximus repeated the familiar pattern. Ambitious and popular with his troops, he declared himself emperor and transported Britain's military forces to the continent. His campaign initially succeeded, but Britain paid a heavy price. The departure of the army weakened defenses and disrupted the economy. Northern and coastal regions suffered renewed attacks, while local authority fragmented. For some parts of Britain, this marked the effective end of Roman rule. Archaeological evidence suggests that military administration disappeared from regions such as Wales and the northern Pennines soon after Maximus departed. A generation later, another commander named Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his troops in Britain. Once again, the legions were taken across the Channel in pursuit of power. Constantine's rebellion ultimately failed, but by then the damage was irreversible. Britain had been repeatedly stripped of its military resources, while the empire itself faced mounting threats elsewhere. In AD 410, the Emperor Honorius informed the British communities that they would have to look to their own defense. Rome withdrew its remaining officials and ended direct administration of the province. The departure of Roman authority did not mean that everyone suddenly abandoned the island. Former soldiers, local leaders, and regional warlords continued to exercise power. Some organized protection in exchange for supplies and taxes. Without the imperial system, however, urban life became increasingly difficult to sustain. Long-distance trade shrank dramatically. Latin faded as an everyday language. Writing became far less common. New groups from the continent, Angles, Saxons, and others, settled in parts of Britain and established their own kingdoms. Roman villas were abandoned, roofs collapsed, mosaic floors cracked, bathhouses filled with water and vegetation. Hadrian's Wall ceased to function as a frontier and became a convenient source of building stone. In some forts, descendants of Roman soldiers remained for a time, preserving fragments of military identity. Elsewhere, local communities scavenged useful materials from the ruins. London offers one of the clearest examples of this transformation. During the Roman period, it had been a thriving commercial center with a population of tens of thousands. After the withdrawal of imperial support, trade declined sharply. Suburbs were abandoned. Public buildings were dismantled for stone. Fields appeared within the city itself. By the end of the 5th century, much of Roman London had become an empty ruin. Bath, York, and other towns followed similar paths. Urban institutions disappeared and populations dispersed into the countryside. Britain did not become uninhabited, but it ceased to be the Roman province it had once been. For later generations, the surviving Roman structures were both impressive and unsettling. Massive walls, arches, and temples stood in landscapes where people no longer possessed the knowledge or resources to build anything comparable. Stories arose about giants and ancient heroes. The ruins seemed to belong to a mythical age. Wells were filled in, ritual objects were deposited, and some sites were avoided altogether. The remains of Roman Britain became part of folklore as much as history. The poem, The Ruin, captures this sense of awe. Its anonymous author looked upon broken halls and collapsed roofs and imagined the greatness that had once existed there. The poem mourns not only the destruction of buildings but the disappearance of an entire world. The fall of Roman Britain was not a single event. It was a long process shaped by military ambition, economic decline, political instability, external pressure, and the gradual breakdown of imperial institutions. Generals repeatedly removed Britain's armies in their attempts to seize power. Trade networks weakened. Cities lost the resources that sustained them. Finally, Rome itself became too fragile to maintain control. Yet the end of Roman rule did not erase the past. The roads remained. The walls remained. The abandoned baths and forums remained. Centuries later, people still walked among those ruins, wondering who had built them and why they had been left behind. That is perhaps the most enduring legacy of Roman Britain. Empires rise, flourish, and disappear, but the landscapes they shape continue to speak long after their rulers are gone. In the broken stones of Bath, the abandoned streets of London, and the weathered blocks of Hadrian's Wall, the memory of a lost civilization survived. And through the words of an anonymous poet, we can still hear the echo of a world that once believed its greatness would last forever.